What we know about the medieval period comes, in large part, from what people wrote down about themselves and others. How do we find out about the less literate societies, like the Vikings, for example? Cat Jarman has spent the last few years working on the remains of the great army at Repton and the material artefacts that they left behind. In her new book, Vikings, she talks about the huge leaps archaeology has made with new technologies and all we can now learn from the teeth in particular, jewellery, and even the metals of the Vikings. Welcome to Future Imperfect.
I am an archaeologist and bioarchaeologist, and I specialise in the Viking Age. So it means that most of my work is based on looking at human remains and all the sort of scientific evidence that we can tease out of bones. And I also write books about the Vikings and, run excavations in England and in Ukraine.
It sounds wonderful, wonderfully interesting. But the term Viking brings with it quite a lot of popular culture, doesn't it? That must be something that you have to fight against all the time. I mean, going back to the earliest days of Hollywood, Vikings are quite sort of sought after, aren't they, as metaphors for adventuring and pillaging and stuff.
Yeah, it's a bit of a double-edged sword in a way. I think in some ways it's fantastic because it creates a lot of engagement and a lot of interest. And I think, especially now, there's so much interest in the Vikings, and I don't think that would have happened if it wasn't for programs like Vikings, The Lost Kingdom, and, games and all, Vikings are kind of everywhere. They're in the popular imagination, and that's great for us because actually a lot of people take that and then they go, okay, that's great, but what about the real thing? So I think in some ways that's absolutely wonderful, but it does, as you say, carry with it some quite difficult things as well, and quite a lot of misconceptions. Some of those are just annoying, the whole horned helmet things you have to keep on repeating, but other things are maybe a little bit more problematic. It tends to be something that appeals to some parts of society that might be quite
because you get into the whole sort of extreme politics a little bit, don't you? That's all sort of tied up with this sort of oddness that goes with runes and all of those kind of things, so you sort of almost can't fully disassociate yourself from that. I mean, a little bit like, for example, the swastika. The swastika is an ancient symbol used in the Far East. It was used on Roman shields, for example. And I know some Roman reenactors just have to not use the swastika on their shields. Even though it was authentic for the period, it means too many awful things for modern people to separate out. So they don't bother. I suppose we're not quite at that extreme yet with Viking symbolism, but we're getting there sometimes.
Yeah, no, actually, I mean, unfortunately, in some parts of the world, it is that extreme. So the Thor's hammer, for example, which is used by so many different people in Scandinavia, that was a very popular symbol, has been and still is really among the neo-Nazi groups. And so a lot of people feel like they can't wear a Thor's hammer, because it might signal to some people that they are part of that particular demographic. And so that can get really problematic, and it's really difficult what you do with that. Do you then sort of move away from those symbols, or do you try to sort of get them back and say, no, you can't appropriate that, and actually sort of fight against it? But it's a tricky one.
We've gone slightly down a darker area than I was expecting to straight away, because I've read a little bit about the Vikings, and obviously my area of interest is the medieval period, which encompasses 1,000 years of European history, which of course is an absurd thing to say you're interested in this 1,000 years. The Vikings are, broadly speaking, early medieval, aren't they? Is that used to be called Dark Ages? Is that right? And where does that come on the scale of academia these days?
Yeah, so that term is another interesting one that a lot of people absolutely hate and want to stop using completely. And I guess it is still quite descriptive in a way, because if you think of it not in terms of the sort of idea that people weren't able to do anything, it's not like a negative, it's not that people were living such horrible, miserable lives, that it was as a dark age, but more that we don't have the amount of information that we had, about the Romans, for example. So there's a big contrast. We don't have the written evidence. There's so much we don't know. So in that sense, it's sort of helpful. But actually, really, we do know a hell of a lot about it. And certainly when we get into the Viking Age, so sort of from 750 onwards, even though the Vikings themselves didn't write down, they haven't, we haven't got literature from the Vikings themselves. Other people write about them and later people write about them. But, even so, there's such a rich amount of evidence from the archaeological record, especially. So it's really not that dark in that sense.
So the very term Viking, I was led to believe that it was more of a job description than an ethnic group. Is that accurate, or is that an oversimplification? How would they have self-identified, for example? There's a sort of the Sea Raiders or whatever.
It's a really good question because we actually don't know. We have no idea really. It's quite clear that they wouldn't have called themselves Vikings. Vikings is a useful term, but it's a term that really we give them. It's certainly not, as you say, an ethnic label. So you can't take a DNA test and say that you're a Viking, even though people try to do that quite often. But, there isn't really such a thing. It seems like identities were much more localized. So if you look at some of the records that we do have and where we talk with people, they might talk about where they've come from and they talk about the region. So it's much more sort of small scale, and we don't actually have the countries of Norway, Sweden and Denmark. The Scandinavian countries don't form until right at the end of the period. So even though in all the English records, Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, they talk about the Danes, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were from what we think of as Denmark. That's a sort of catch-all term, really. But the word Viking really does refer to sort of going out raiding or going out on these expeditions, not necessarily violent ones. But that really is where that comes from. So I don't think somebody would say, well, yes, I am a Viking. I think, maybe they would say that they're going, on a sort of expedition that is a sort of Viking expedition. But yeah, absolutely not an ethnic term. But we don't have anything else. So we're a bit stuck. So I'm quite happy because we all know, we use that as a shorthand, really. There was an exhibition in Sweden called The People We Call the Vikings, which was a title of it. And I think that's quite a nice way of thinking about it.
That is quite sweet. Terms are funny, aren't they? Because they mean lots of things to lots of people. And it's like having jargon. When you publish a book with Viking on the title, people kind of know what you mean. But once you sort of start to open up the term and look into it in a bit more detail, it sort of becomes a bit more nebulous. I presume... you talked about they were going on seaborne expeditions. So was this very much part of what we call the Viking culture, the idea of get in a boat with some friends and go and explore? And is there a reason why that seems to have happened or caught the popular imagination of the time? That seems to be a thing they all wanted to do.
Yeah, it pretty much is one of those defining features, I suppose, of what we call the Viking Age. It is this outwards expansion, especially overseas. I think it happens for a number of reasons. One of them is the technology. So it's the ships. So the ships are really developing right at the beginning of that period. These beautiful, wonderful Viking ships that are so well suited to long distance journeys. And the new things, new developments are, the big keel that makes them very stable, the shape of the hull that's very flexible. So they go across the North Sea without any problems at all. And the use of the sail as well, which people have been using sails for much longer. Romans had sails, Egyptians had sails, but in Scandinavia, in Northern Europe, it wasn't really used. So the combination of all of that suddenly meant that it was very possible. And so you got these fantastic ships that can go across the North Sea or across the Baltic or wherever, and then they can land on a beach, silently, quickly, easily, shallow water. And then, as one of the keys to my research in my book, which I've named River Kings, because rivers actually are really crucial to that success as well. So I think that technology is one big part. But then the fact that they can do this, and there's this travel, there's this contact, the trade networks, the journeys, you can get not just across to the North Sea, you can go to Iceland, to Greenland, to North America, all the way down east, down the rivers of Eastern Europe, down to Constantinople. There's all this huge reach that brings things back. So it brings money, it brings wealth, silver especially, and lots of exotic objects. So all these things become really treasured, really valuable in the period. So people want that, both, for the actual wealth, but also I think that the sort of social capital of being out. So in the same way that, you might go on a gap year and you go out and traveling and you come back and you sort of tell everyone about your gap year and all these wonderful things you've done. There's a sort of social capital involved in that. And so that also, those connections, those sort of experiences also become something very desirable. So all of those things sort of meet up together, I think, to sort of make it a big part of the period.
So how do we know that people travelled to Constantinople or to North America? As you say, they didn't really write much down, but they must have left things behind? Is that how we can trace the expansion of the Viking expeditions?
Yes, there's a few ways you can do that. One of the big problems we have in archaeology is that objects can move on their own. Same with ideas. So, designs on objects and art and types of buildings, those things can move without people. So you never quite know for sure. But I mean, in general, we see certain things that are so specifically Scandinavian and Viking age in all those places, types of houses. And there's sort of big collections of things that make it pretty obvious that these are Scandinavians or Vikings. But there's accounts from other people, so people who have met these Vikings and described them, talked about them. So we got, even though they themselves didn't write them down, we've got those records. And then there's also the work that I do, which is looking at actual skeletons. So we can look at chemical traces that we all have in our bodies of where we've grown up, the sort of food we've eaten, the water we've drunk. All of that leaves trace in our bodies that, makes us like walking diaries of our lives. We can look at that now, which is also another fascinating way of pinpointing exactly.
So how does that work? And how detailed can you get? These are presumably chemical signals, are they, in parts of the body that, survive your death, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of working out where somebody grew up and where they came from, we look at isotopes in tooth enamel, because we literally are what we eat. So everything you eat and drink becomes part of your skin and your hair and your bones. And those elements that are incorporated into your food have little chemical variations that reflect the sort of place that your food was grown, the wheat was grown or the water fell as rain. And they're different in different geographical regions. I grew up in Norway, for example, so I took up water, oxygen from the water in Norway that I was drinking as a child. That became part of my tooth enamel. When that's formed in childhood, it never changes. So my teeth have locked in the oxygen isotopes from Norway. So if I pull that one of my own teeth and analysed it in a lab, that would show me that I came from a colder climate. And then you can look at other things that show the geology, older rock, granite rocks and that sort of thing. Whereas my kids have grown up in the south of England, so they've got teeth that are completely different from mine. So you can look at that. The enamel stays the same. It's really stable, so it lasts for thousands of years, which is fantastic if you're an archaeologist. And yeah, you can pinpoint it. You can't. It's not, unfortunately, sort of postcode specific, so it doesn't give you. I can't pinpoint my home address, but you can say that it's somewhere like Scandinavia. So it gives us a really good idea.
So it's a broad geographical distribution. You can get a good idea, and then if you find a burial in Constantinople and you look at the teeth, and that person grew up in what's now Norway, it's pretty clear they've travelled from one place to the other. Right.
Exactly. And then when you combine that with things like artefacts, maybe grave goods, like the sites I've worked on, Repton in Derbyshire, there's a warrior who's buried with, a sword, a Thor's hammer around his neck. And then we can look at his teeth and they're very consistent with somewhere like probably Denmark. So then you have that combination of both the objects and also the isotopes. And then, that's a pretty good clue.
Did the Vikings leave any graffiti or symbols anywhere? We talk about the Viking runes and things. Did they actually, given that they had a bit of a reputation of being capable of breaking the law, shall we say, were they literate at all? Did they write anything? Do we have any records of that on ancient monuments or anything like that?
Yeah, we do actually. Quite a lot of it. There's quite a lot of graffiti. Mostly it's quite basic. The most famous, most exciting examples, I think, are in the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. So in what was then Constantinople, which was one of the key destinations around the eastern route, so one of those sort of big trading places. We know that there was a lot of Scandinavians who travelled there and actually worked as mercenaries, the so-called Varangian Guard, which was the personal sort of bodyguards of the Byzantine emperor. And in the cathedral, or in the, it's now a mosque, up on the railings, there's actually graffiti in several places with names. One of them is Halfdan, so somebody which is a proper Scandinavian name, Viking name, and it's in rune, and it basically pretty much says Halfdan was here. And there's somebody else called Arnie down the road. And then there's what is probably a Viking ship on one of the columns as well. And I just love that because you can imagine this bored, big hulking great Viking soldier just scratching away.
A Varangian guard who travelled all that way. He wanted to sort of have an adventure and he's ended up being incredibly well paid, standing around, doing absolutely nothing for this Byzantine emperor. He's bored out of his mind, but he's thinking, well, I'm getting a lot of money. So maybe I'll give it another year and then maybe I'll buy a boat and go somewhere else. I love that human side. And whilst I'm not particularly keen on modern graffiti. These messages that are left behind from ordinary people are somehow very humanizing, because somebody was standing there and carved their name. I wonder if that Viking was carving his name going, I wonder if in a few hundred years somebody will read this and wonder who I was.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think he'd ever have the perspective to think in 1,000 years' time somebody was going to sit and talk about me. I don't know. Maybe he did.
Maybe he did. Maybe his name has lived on as much as some people in sagas. He came up with a really good way of living forever. So the Vikings went east all the way to Constantinople, and all the welfare and spices were hugely valuable, and fighting men were sought after. And I presume they looked sufficiently different and were they larger physically than the local people in Constantinople in a broad sense?
Yeah, they would have been. And we know that was noticed as well. So there's this brilliant record by an Arab traveller called Ibn Fadlan, who wrote a sort of travel description. He was essentially on a missionary mission on the Volga River. He encountered these people, these Eastern Vikings that are known as the Rus, and he describes them. And there's a few accounts, actually. And in one of these, he explains that these are essentially the sort of tallest and most beautiful people he has ever seen. And he explains that they really are, bigger. So they're unusual enough for him to describe that. So clearly they did stand out quite noticeably.
Yeah. And with the physical remains, can you tell how muscled people were or how kind of physically competent, perhaps? I mean, they talk about some of the English longbowmen's bodies being slightly warped by the training that was needed to draw the longbow of the power that they drew it. Is there anything like that we can tell from the Viking skeletal remains?
Unfortunately not. We don't have that evidence, which isn't to say that wasn't the case, because there's lots of bits of your bones that will strengthen with the muscle attachments and things like that will actually alter your skeleton. So it is possible to see it, and there's lots of examples in the archaeological record of that happening. From the Viking Age, unfortunately, we don't have any. It's partially because a lot of the bone material is really badly preserved in Scandinavia. So it's possible that in the future some of that might come up, but so far we don't have any evidence. Or it might be that actually perhaps they weren't as specialized, because that really happens when you're very, very specialized and you do certain things a lot. It does seem like some of the evidence that we have suggests that a lot of people would go out and fight just for a little bit. It wasn't a sort of professional career. It wasn't that sort of really, really intense behavior that would cause a physical change, but people might just take part in raids for a couple of summers or something like that. So that could be another reason. We just don't quite know.
Okay. And of course, popular culture often gets things like costumes and hairstyles incredibly theatrically interpreted. I mean, basically wrong, horribly wrong, to the point that real Vikings would have just laughed uproariously about them. And I'm particularly keen on armour. Do we have much evidence in the way that Vikings were armed and armoured, or the way they were dressed, or the way they held their hair, or anything like that?
No, not as much as we'd like, unfortunately. And certainly things like helmets, there's only a very tiny number, only really one quite well-preserved helmets from Norway from the Viking Age. There's very few of them. Whether that means that nobody really had helmets, or if they were made in several pieces, if they were sort of taken apart. We know lots of metals, iron especially, was recycled and reused, so that can happen quite quickly. And in a battle situation, we know that the opposite side would quite easily go after the battle and go pick up any remains of weapons or armour and actually take it and reuse it or recycle it. But it's also possible that a lot of leather was used, and obviously leather doesn't save that well in the archaeological record, certainly not in Scandinavia. So those problems do exist. And I mean, there are some records and things like hair. We do know things like tattoos in popular culture. It seems like every Viking would have their head shaved, half shaved, and have undercuts and tattoos and all of that sort of thing. But there are some records. Again, it's one of those Arab records that explains that some of those Rus people had tattoos, had pictures drawn on them. So certain things we do know. We do have some clothes, but again, it's unfortunately not as well known as we would like.
What about swords and spears, those and shields? Those, I think, have survived a little more. We have a bit more of the remains of those, I think.
Yes, certainly swords we have an awful lot of in Scandinavia.
And those are incredibly highly decorated, aren't they, sometimes with precious metals? Does that indicate wealth, or were these high status weapons that are the ones we found?
Yeah, it could be a little bit of both, I think. But I think also a sword was a very personal thing. And there's lots of records, and certainly in the sagas as well, of swords being named and being essentially almost human-like. But sort of they had personalities and all these things. So they seem to be very, very special. So it's certainly something that you would invest in, and it would be yours, or it might be passed on. They come into burials quite often. Interestingly, a lot of them in burials are also deliberately bent and broken for whatever reason, whether that is for a very practical reason so that nobody would steal them, just dig them up and steal them and reuse them, or if it's some other belief that you have to sort of ritually kill the sword when the person dies. We don't know. But yeah, no, they really are. And some of them are exceptionally beautifully inlaid with silver and gold. So clearly the sword was very important to the warrior at the time.
Which is interesting now. I handle my own swords quite a lot. I do quite a lot of training from horseback, totally different period than the Viking period. But because the ones I have are custom made, they are very different. They do feel different in the hand. So I can completely understand how somebody would have a favorite sword, or a sword would feel really good to them or very familiar. And interestingly, I find that the sword has a particular way round. And I don't know whether we can tell anything about wear on edges or anything like that, but I've always wanted to ask an expert on swords, historic swords, if you can tell if there's a way round that the sword was used, or was it equally used on both sides? Because from my experience, a sword has a particular way round, even though it's double-edged. But spears were probably the main fighting weapon, though, weren't they, in battle?
This is part of the problem, right? So we don't necessarily know what was used in a battle. The sources that we have are either random finds that just turn up somewhere on their own, so a sword or a spear or whatever, or they're from graves. And both those are sort of quite selective. So we don't actually have a good source that says, okay, here's the battle, here's, if you've got 1,000 men, these are the weapons they had. There's no rule book, there's no description. We don't have battlefields, so we can't sort of go out and count and say, okay, here's how many broken spears we have. So it's very difficult to say in reality how those things actually happen. So unfortunately, we just don't have those answers.
And I suppose it would depend very much on context. And if you were going to just go on an adventure and try and settle somewhere, you would possibly take different equipment than if you were going to go and raid a monastery and you were going up against people that wouldn't fight back. You probably want to move fast, have some big bags so that you can put really important things in there, make sure you bring some rope to tie people up and then capture them. You weren't really expecting a proper scrap. Whereas if you were going somewhere where you might expect a scrap, you could imagine putting together a totally different set of equipment for that particular mission. And they were certainly bright enough and sensible enough to plan, I would imagine, plan an expedition. Do we know how Viking crews were actually raised? Would there be a sort of charismatic leader that would effectively send out the equivalent of a social media message saying, I've got a ship, I'm going to go out in the summer and we're going to go raiding? Do we know how any of that worked at all?
We think that's probably what happened, more or less. I think some of it was, it'd be a localized, I think, a lot of the time. So it would be in the local community, there would be a need for it. And so people who were the right age or stage of their lives or whatever and fit and suited to it would join along, and they might have some responsibilities, but they probably would also want to, because we know that people were getting paid, so they were getting paid usually in silver for taking part in these missions, so they weren't necessarily forced. Some probably were, but it also seems like some were essentially like mercenaries as well, who just join in. There's plenty of records, not from the Vikings themselves, but others that people could join in and just essentially just come along. And from the archaeology, from the bones, so there's a few graves that we think are from armies, a few mass graves. One of them is the one I've worked on at Repton in Derbyshire, where we've got a burial of nearly 300 people buried together that we think were part of the Great Army, the Great Heathen Army. And the isotopes from those, so that looking again at those teeth and where they came from, it's really interesting because they're not all from one place. They're from really, really varied places that could be all over Scandinavia. A few also from slightly milder climates, which is a bit odd. But that's really interesting because that shows that it's not just a very local group. It's people from all over the place. So how and why that happens, we don't quite know. But presumably, you can join these forces along the way for however long it sort of works out for you, I suppose.
I quite like the idea of a charismatic leader sort of sending messages out saying, all right, I'm looking for 100 strong men to come with me on an adventure. I just think that would be brilliant if it happened that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people, they want that fortune, they want all that wealth. And, it's become something that everyone does. And certainly towards the end of the Viking Age, we have so many sources, things like rune stones. There's a lot of them in Sweden that towards the sort of turn of the millennium, and they talk about where people have gone. So there's stones that say such and such went to England, such and such went to the east, and sometimes they say they might have fought in Knut's army or whatever. But there's such great big numbers, and they're almost like advertising posters saying how much wealth they came back with. So if you see everybody else around you, it's like that sort of gap year effect again. Everyone else is doing, they're having a great time, and they're, posting their photos, and they come back and tell you about all these amazing places they went to, the beach in Thailand or whatever. And, when you have all that coming back, there's an incentive again for, I think, especially young people, young men, presumably, to go out. So when that call comes up, then people go, yeah, I could do with a bit of fun for a few years and a bit of wealth.
So those runestones are very strong propaganda in many ways to encourage other people to do that. Look, these people had a wonderful time. If you don't get your act together, you're going to have a very boring life instead.
Yeah, you're going to miss out.
Yeah. So what about the end of the Viking Age? I mean, it's always funny to talk about the end of any particular historical period because self-evidently nobody ever woke up not a Viking. They were born a Viking and then died one, but people were born that probably didn't self-identify in the same way. Is there a sort of an official end to it, as it were, or is it one of those very sort of blurry things that academics argue about?
Yeah, no, we definitely argue. We argue about everything. So, of course, it depends a little bit where you are. If you're in England, it's 1066 and, the conquest. But in Scandinavia, it depends which country you're in as well. But I mean, there's definitely something that happens. There's changes that happen that are quite clear. So there is a break. You don't have the same rate. You don't have that same outwards movement anymore. But also you have the formation of the kingdoms of Norway, Sweden and Denmark. And that really happens around the millennium, around about year 1000 or a little bit afterwards. And suddenly you have these great big kingdoms that are pretty unified. You've got lots of other social changes. You have things like urbanity. You've got actual proper towns for the first time. You start getting currency, proper money coming in. So there's some really quite significant changes. Of course, the biggest one is Christianity that becomes almost completely adopted across Scandinavia. So with all of those changes happening, there's a clear shift there. So it isn't specific. It doesn't happen in a day. It doesn't happen at the same time. And you got, contact, for example, if you look at Britain, you have contact with Scotland, and the Orkneys are under Scandinavian, under Norwegian rule for really quite a long time. So you have a lot of connection. You've got more raids going on, but there is a clear change there. There's a difference. So it does make sense to talk about an end.
That's interesting because sometimes people have talked about the Norman conquest, and effectively it was one set of Vikings fighting against another set of Vikings, really, some people have said. How true is that? Because, of course, England was heavily settled by the Danes, as I believe they were largely called at the time, Daneaxes, and the Britons themselves, or the ethnic Britons, were pushed to Wales and Cornwall and further away places. But the Normans, they were Northmen, weren't they? That's the whole point of the name. They settled in France, and they were Vikings too.
Yeah, absolutely. So the whole, Norman, the whole dynasty really starts with a Scandinavian, we don't know if he's Danish or Norwegian, but Rollo, who was essentially given Normandy. So yeah, they are the Northmen. That's where that comes from. So that whole, William the Conqueror is descended, I think is something like great grandson or something of Rollo, that first settler. So they really are Scandinavian as well. But also I think you have to remember that England was very much shaped by Scandinavia and all that contact. So not just the settlers, but also just really not very long before you have someone like Knut. He's a Danish king who was actually ruling England and Norway and Denmark at the same time. So the Scandinavian impact on England really, I think, must be taken into consideration. It's a huge part of England itself. So I think that's absolutely, there's so much more of it than I think people like to think.
I always find it funny because obviously at school you learn a simplified form of history, and it's always sort of Normans who are French and the Saxons who are English, and the Norman conquest and everything. We still call it that. But in fact, there's basically a whole bunch of roughy-tufty Viking descendants having a big scrap over who gets the kingdom. It's not really anything that's mappable in the same way to sort of England or France or Norway in the way we would like to think these days.
No, and I think those countries sort of they form in that period as well, really. So, and then that's part of the key of it, I think. It's really round about that time that all these countries, all these nations start to form. So some of it is also, I think, what's been passed on later because they were creating kingdoms, creating countries. All the sort of propaganda, everything that the written records relate to that as well. So it's in their benefit to try and make it sound like they were. So maybe that history that we've learned later on is quite often quite coloured by those later sources.
Yes, and as you know, history is often completely coloured by the contemporary politics of the time, and the history of empire, is reflected in all sorts of odd things.
One record, which is the settlement of Iceland, for example, which is recorded in a book. There's a book of settlement, essentially, which is a tiny bit later than the actual settlement itself. But that describes, all those first settlers. But it's also always kind of where they came from specifically in Norway, what region they came from, whose son or daughter they were. It was all related to your family, and it was related to the very local region. So it wasn't this kind of big ethnic thing at all. They weren't saying, well, here's a Norwegian. But he was very much, you're from Wiltshire, you're the daughter of such and such, or whatever it is. So it's kind of that smaller scale. I think we are so used to thinking on a bigger scale that I think actually for a lot of people, it was much more important who your father was, who your grandfather was, exactly where you grew up.
I'd just like to finish on rivers, because we often think of the Vikings as doing everything by sea and landing on the coast. But I believe that rivers were absolutely essential to sort of their strategies. And your River Kings book, I presume it's all about that.
Yeah, it really is. And when I wrote that book, I wanted to shift the focus off the big sea journeys and off the, expeditions across the North Atlantic or whatever, because I think actually it is those internal journeys that have such a huge impact. If you think about England, so the site that I've spent the last decade working on in Derbyshire, Repton, that's really right in the centre of the country, and actually to get there with a huge force of several thousand is quite tricky. If you think about muddy winter in England and all those people, and you're trying to move quite swiftly around the country, but it is right on the River Trent, and the Trent is like a motorway and super convenient, and you can just go in the Humber and you can get down and right into the country so fast. And if you look at all the sites, especially the early raids, they start on the coast and then they start moving inland. All the big sites are all located along rivers. And in Eastern Europe, it's so crystal clear the way you can get from the Baltic and down to the Black Sea on the rivers. And that route, opening up that sort of back route with those networks is absolutely incredible. And I think that really is, to my mind, almost, more important than going across the sea, because it just taps into so many other networks, and you can go, overland. And also, I think the other thing they did was to control those rivers. So they controlled the trade, they controlled who could go. They're quite easy to control, whereas the big sea, you can just go across in a slightly different direction and nobody can stop you. But a river is so narrow. If you can stop that, it's like having a toll road or something like that. You can really control movements so much. And I think that's one of the things that the Vikings did so well.
And of course, their boats were perfectly suited to shallow rivers. And of course, you have the two options. You can sail if the wind is going in the right direction, or you row. And they were pretty fast at rowing and kept them fit.
Yes, exactly. So it's just perfect, really. And I think coming back to what we talked about earlier about that technology that really made this all happen is the boats, and it was the ability, and they were pretty tough people. But if you look at somewhere like the geography of Norway, you really travel by boat. So almost rivers are a bit like the coastline and all the fjords. It's quite similar as a sort of idea, that the way you have to travel. So I think that kind of makes sense to me.
Wonderful. Well, look, we've only just really scraped the surface of the Viking Age, but it's been fascinating talking to you about it. I'd love to talk again in a little bit more detail. I'm particularly fascinated by the sort of science behind finding out where people are from and what they might have done in their lives. But we've run out of time now to do that. If people want to find out, you've got your book, River Kings. And is there anything else you'd want to sort of, a website or, people following you on Twitter or anything like that to find out more?
Yeah, absolutely. No, very welcome to me. I do post quite a lot on Twitter. So my Twitter handle is just at Cat Jarman. And I've got a podcast as well called Gone Medieval, where I talk more about, lots of topics, medieval topics, especially Vikings, as much as I can, various films and documentaries. So yeah, just search online and there should be things coming up.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for talking with us, and I look forward to speaking to you again.
Yeah, no, likewise. Thank you so much for having me.